Good morning, and thanks for joining us. My name is Eamon Timmins. I'm the Media Relations Manager for Concern Worldwide. On behalf of DCU and Concern, I'd like to welcome you to our Communicating Climate webinar to promote this important new guide for young journalists, storytellers, and others working to communicate climate change. We are delighted to have three expert panelists with us today to speak about the challenges and opportunities around communicating climate change. We will be joined by Dr. Dave Robbins. He's the Associate Professor of Journalism at DCU and one of the co-authors of this new publication covering the climate, a guide for student journalists. We're also joined by Caroline O'Doherty, the Environment Correspondent with the Irish Independent. And online, we will be joined by Jackson McKenway, who is Concern Kenya's sector lead for food security and livelihoods. And he's working on the front line of climate change with communities severely impacted by climate change. For those who don't know anything about Concern, we are a humanitarian organisation working in 26 of the world's poorest countries to end extreme poverty. Last year, we reached 30 million people. As I said, we are a humanitarian organisation. It's extreme poverty is our focus, not climate change. We're not a climate-specific organisation. So the question is, why would we be involved in today's event? Well, quite bluntly, because climate change is one of the major drivers of hunger and extreme poverty around the world today. The impact of climate change is devastating. In recent years alone, you can look at the devastating drought across the Horn of Africa, the 2022 floods in Pakistan, which left a third of the country underwater, and countries like Bangladesh with cyclones, river floods, rising sea levels. So climate change is really challenging communities, the very existence of certain communities. Here in Ireland, we work through our climate campaign, One Planet for All, which works with young climate activists and climate youth groups through several of our program countries, such as Bangladesh and Malawi. We also have regular climate series called COP On, which brings together climate activists and those seeking to understand the wider impacts of climate change. And just last week, we had an intergenerational climate cafe. And in October, we will have a big climate workshop and a series of events in Dublin. But today we're here to launch the this important climate resource. We're grateful to our partners in DCU for working with us on this. Through this resource, DCU and Concern want to motivate the next generation of journalists, storytellers and activists and climate change champions to better communicate around climate change. We want to showcase the voices of those most impacted by climate change, relay the facts, share successful climate measures, and challenge false narratives. So we really would encourage you to engage with the resource. We will be putting a link to it in the chat box once Dave has finished his presentation. Throughout the presentations, if you have any questions, we really would encourage your questions, and you pop them in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen rather than the chat box. So the question and answer box, pop any questions in there. If you could put your name on it, that would be helpful as well. So we'll get down to the formal part of the webinar. Our first panelist to speak will be Dr. Dave Robbins. Dave, you're very welcome. Dave is the Associate Professor of Journalism at DCU. He's worked for 25 years as a journalist for the Irish Times, the Irish Independent, the Evening Herald and RTE, and also worked as an advisor to the Minister for the Environment. Dave is the founding director of DCU's Centre for Climate and Society and is the co-founder of its flagship degree, the MSc in Climate Change Policy, Media and Society. He is the inaugural chair of the Broadcasting Sustainability Network, and he has delivered training on climate journalism to a range of organisations, including Commission de Man, RTE, the Irish Examiner, and the Bauer Media Group. And of a media relevance today, he's one of the co-authors of this new publication on climate change. So very welcome, Dave. Can you tell us a little about the resource, why it's needed, and maybe highlight some of the main points?
Sure. Thanks very much, Eamon. Just to say, we were really delighted when Concern approached us about this because it's something that we do in our centre where we really want to improve the climate change awareness and knowledge in the media sector. And so we were very happy to get involved in this, and we're actually very proud of the end product. We had a bit of a chat as to whether it's a resource, a guide, or a handbook, and it's kind of a bit of all of those things. I'd encourage you to check it out. It's an online PDF, and I'm just going to talk you through a couple of the contents. But first, I want to just say a little bit about why it's necessary to have a guide like this. So the first reason, I suppose, is that when we look at where people get their information about climate change from, it's the news media. It's either TV news or online and print news. So it's not the government and it's not kind of, environmental NGOs. There's a very good guy who works on this called Wolfgang Blau in the Reuters Institute in Oxford, who says whether we want it or not, it's fallen to the media to explain this to the public. But when we look at how equipped the media are to do that, it's a bit concerning because, in our engagement with media organizations, the levels of climate literacy, basic climate knowledge or knowledge of different aspects of climate change is quite low. Newsrooms are very stretched. So dedicated environmental correspondents like Caroline are quite rare, and so we're finding that expertise on climate change is being outsourced. So you might get in somebody to write an op-ed, or you might get somebody so the expertise is leaving the newsroom and it's being outsourced. And when it's outsourced to kind of think tanks or other lobbying organizations, it's rife, for vested interest to be very influential. We also need a good, strong media sector with good climate awareness, because we need to push back about some of the narratives that are coming to the fore now about that climate change isn't happening, it's not real, it's a hoax, the usual kind of conspiracy theories that you would hear are really, we thought we had killed them, but they're coming back online, especially as climate policies start to be implemented. The other reason that we want to help journalists with this is because it's such a vast topic. Like, it's so many scientific disciplines, from, atmospheric science, water, there's also the financial market side, carbon trading. It is really incredibly complex, and it's very, very difficult for a single journalist to be across all the research that is published and so on. And especially, I find, as journalists are not really trained to assess research. It's very hard for a journalist to say, this is good research, this is bad research. So they need all the help that they can get. And that's why this guide is kind of a really good starting point for anybody who wants to get into climate. And I suppose, lastly, everybody is going to be a climate change reporter in one way or another soon. It's not going to be just the environment correspondent's job. It's going to be there'll be a climate element to every kind of news beat. So I think, that's why it's needed. And I'd just like to kind of give you a brief idea of what's in it. So these are the different sections. The first one, and we try and always start with the science, because if you don't have a good, solid basis, in your knowledge of the science, everything else is on shaky foundations after that. And you find it very hard to rebut people who put out disinformation, because you're not sure of your own information somehow. So it is a very, very accessible guide to the different aspects of climate change and the greenhouse effect, the different gases involved, the different governance things that are in place. We come into a couple of sections about climate change communication, different ways to talk about climate change, and a little bit about how the media have done it, different ways the media have approached it. The bit I quite like is the bit about how to write about climate change from zero, from how to come up with ideas, how to develop ideas for a climate change story, what sources to include, where you can get good information, and then how to actually go about writing it, different ways of writing the intro and including your sources in the story. And lastly, we have a section about, climate change can be very kind of overwhelming topic, and a lot of the news coverage is focused on disastrous impacts of climate change, and that's fine. That needs to be there, but we also need other ways of telling the story. There's something called solutions journalism, which doesn't begin with the problem. Like an example, sorry, I know I'm talking for a long time, but an example would be housing. If every story starts with the housing problem, then we get this idea that it's a kind of a never-ending and insurmountable problem. Solutions journalism foregrounds solutions. It doesn't say there isn't a problem, but it just puts the problem in the context of a potential solution. So there's that section about positive storytelling, solutions journalism, and also something that can be missing a lot is we kind of have a very good idea of what we're running away from, you know, with the floods and the wildfires and so on, but we don't have a huge idea of what we're running towards, what a post-transition society might look like, what the future might look like in a sustainable world. So we are trying to encourage journalists in that last section to give that vision of why you're doing all this stuff, and what the future might look like in there. Now, I'm just was talking about, maybe we're going to come back to that later on, or would you like me to mention it here? So there's a discourse out there that climate change is happening slowly and somewhere else to other people, and therefore it's difficult to get Irish audiences engaged with it. And some of the ways journalists can do this is to link every story to climate. There is an environmental angle to most stories. The way, you know, in journalism, there's this kind of understood context about the economy and jobs. You know, they're kind of a given context in which a lot of stories happen. We can add the environment to that, to those contexts. We can certainly, I think the EPA's climate change in the Irish Mind survey, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but there's around 60% of Irish people believe climate change is happening in Ireland now. Okay, so it's not something far off, distant, happening to people in distant countries. Journalists can bring in attribution studies, which are these pieces of research that can tell you how much more likely a certain event was made because we're living in a climate changed world. So to know, journalists should know how to report about those. Even if climate impacts can't engage audiences, because although we have had flooding and sea level rise in Ireland, compared to what other countries are going through, it's been relatively minor. We can still make it relevant to Irish people by bringing in the fact that we have binding commitments. We are facing fines for missing our targets. We are, it's in a kind of regulatory environment that will have an impact on Irish people. And then I think, again, to emphasize this idea about solutions, because there's quite a lot of doomism on social media and in the kind of public discourse that it's a done deal and nothing, it's pointless trying to do anything about it. And that's just wrong. Every part of every degree matters, so every climate action matters. So if we focus on solutions and actions, then I think we can engage audiences that way. So thanks, Eamon.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic summary of a very, very detailed guide. Guide is kind of it's very user friendly. It's written and it's beautifully laid out, but there's a lot of detail in it. So I think you did a remarkable job in 5 minutes to summarize it in there. I think we'd say to people, look, the link to that guide is in the chat column. If you take nothing away from today's webinar, if you download that and read it, you'll have got a lot out of it. Our second panelist today is Caroline O'Doherty. Caroline is the environment correspondent of the Irish Independent. Prior to this role, she worked for over 20 years as a news correspondent. In the current position, Caroline is reporting on climate change, the natural and built environment, and the people and policies making and blocking progress. So very welcome, Caroline. And can I ask you to maybe just give us an overview? What are the biggest challenges when it comes to covering climate as an environment correspondent for the country's largest selling daily paper?
Well, thanks for having me here, and thanks also for the handbook. I'm calling it a handbook. It's an old-fashioned word, but it is more than that, because there's so many other links within the handbook to other resources. It's a really, really good publication. Dave outlined some of the difficulties there and the challenges, and they apply to me and they apply to my work, which is from the perspective of not just an Irish publication, but it's a mainstream media publication. So your challenges will be different if you're working for a specialist publication or a specialist program within a bigger news organization. So from my perspective, the story can be a strong story, it can be strong analysis, it can be a strong report. It is competing all the time with all the other news out there. You're trying to get space for your story, be that in print or online or airtime. More than that, you're trying to get prominence for it, particularly online, because online, people say, well, online has space for everything. The flip side of that is that everything is in the online space. So prominence is important. Otherwise, the story can be there and it's touching nobody and nobody's getting to it. And the difficulties there are the same sort of tests apply to any news story. When you're going to a news desk and you want a story, you want space for it, you want prominence for it. How is it going to impact people? Is it here? Is it now? Is it personal? Is climate change here in Ireland? Yes, it is. The examples, I suppose, they're more subtle, far more subtle than the big dramatic situations that are happening in other countries. So there still is that kind of, it's a far away issue, problem in making that immediate connection with people. Is it now? Yes, but again, there's that issue. Yes, we've had extreme weather events. Yes, if you look at we have this gradual trend towards warming all the time. We're probably going to have more records broken May, even though it's been extremely cloudy. It's still been warm day and night. The temperature has stayed high. So is it now? Yes, but we do tend to talk a lot about the future when we're discussing climate. Inevitably, we have to, because we're trying to avoid the worst impacts, which are coming in the future. But even if the future is only mid-century, where there may well be major tipping points ahead, that's only 25 years away. It's still not now, in the sense that now, midnight tonight, the price of petrol is going up at the pumps. It's still not now, as there's a bank holiday weekend coming and I want to make plans and what's on. So we have very short attention spans right now, this minute, and very short attention spans for what lies immediately ahead. So it's not now in that same way as other stories. Is it personal? That really depends on your experience in Ireland. If you lived in Middleton and were Riverside last October, you may well have a new perspective. You may well feel that climate change is getting personal to you. If you're a potato farmer, you've had a rotten, terrible time the last few months in Ireland. If you're someone who has really close relatives, in Canada or Australia, or where the wildfire seasons are starting off again in North America and they're horrendous, you may well know the panic and fear and loss that they've been through, and that may well feel personal. But for the most part, most people in Ireland at the moment, climate change doesn't really feel personal. So those are tough tests to get your story space and prominence. Let's say we scrape through those tests and there is an interest out there. Climate literacy, Dave, you mentioned that too, and that comes from both the journalist writing the story and it comes from the person who's going to try and read it, because it is complicated. Once we get beyond fossil fuels are bad, which is the source of all of this, it then gets complicated, because there is the science, there's the language policy, which is a lot of jargon, you have the energy systems, which are very confusing. We went from people just flicking a switch and not ever asking where their power energy come from, to now asking them to think about it and to think about where the alternatives lie. And there's the financial markets. It is complicated. Okay, so let's say we've got a certain climate literacy in both the writer of the piece and the reader. We then have this other issue, and it's not really climate denial. There is climate denial out there, and some of it is genuine. Some people who don't believe. A lot of it is orchestrated for commercial purposes, for profit, for companies. But most people accept that climate change is happening and they understand the basics of the science of it. But there is a sense of what I would call climate disbelief, in that people are still quite incredulous that we've got to this stage, that it's as bad as we're saying it is, that the implications are as long reaching into the future and as wide ranging as we say they are. And there's a disbelief also that we don't have sort of ready-made technological solutions that are quick fixes and that can be sort of painlessly applied. So and that's a kind of a defense mechanism, I think, because people are still really trying to grasp it. So there's all those issues to get through, which is kind of different. A lot of the stuff, a lot of the early tests on a story, you'll apply, unconsciously. You just do it automatically. You'll do this automatic assessment whether the story is going to get in, whether it's going to get space, whether it's going to get prominence. I think when it comes to climate stories, you have those added sort of questions like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to frame it? How am I going to phrase it? And it's just it is a complicated topic to start off with. So that's been the difference, I suppose, between trying to report climate and maybe trying to report anything else I've reported in the sort of before the last 5 years.
Very good, thank you very much. Between yourself and Dave, there's a lot of issues there which we want to unpack and have a chat about, and we get to the discussion part of the webinar. Is Jackson available? Jackson is not available. We were due to bring our colleague Jackson McKenway in from Nairobi. He is not online. We're having trouble connecting. You were in Kenya in 2022. I think you traveled with Concern, Caroline, with a couple of other journalists. I'm not sure, did we meet Jackson? I don't think we did. But you would have seen, it would have been the middle of that historic drought, the worst drought in 40 years. What were your recollections or reflections as an environmental journalist at looking at something which we don't necessarily see too often, the very sharp edge of climate change? So it was 5 successive failed rains. I remember one morning we were in a village which hadn't rained in 2 years. I hadn't seen rain. And while they get rain twice a year, it's a dry, semi-arid area. They don't have 5 failed rains. What were your recollections of that visit or that trip?
I think it was the sheer impossibility of what people were facing and what people have been through, to find that people were still there and dealing with this, and that they hadn't just fled. A lot of people had moved on, but people were still there trying to live in what you would have to say were uninhabitable circumstances, and with the question mark as if they would ever be habitable again. Was this a livelihood they could ever return to? Was this a home they could ever have a long-term future in? So that was the big thing, because then you stop talking about climate mitigation and you stop talking about climate adaptation. You kind of almost feel like saying, well, that's it, game up, it's over in this part of the world, in this country, for these particular people who live this particular lifestyle, it's over. But then I did come back and I spoke to some in the University of Nairobi. I spoke to people who are working with the geology and the geography and the topography and the weather, and to hear them tell me, well, there are water sources. There are water sources. They're not easy to get to, but they're fairly reliable. We've done some case studies. We've done some pilots and digging. There are water sources. So it will need policy, it will need decision, it will need commitment at political level. It will need technological, fairly sophisticated technological solutions, which are available. It will need finance. And you're faced with those two kind of scenarios. So you completely wipe out an area and a people and a livelihood and a lifestyle and say it's gone forever and can't be got back? Or do you say there are solutions here? And what would it take to get those implemented? So it's you're always kind of, particularly you're looking at the two and saying, where's the choice and who's going to make this decision? And what's your role as a journalist? All you can do is kind of highlight that the two potential situations are there, and maybe hope that the right choice is taken, whatever the right choice is, because I think there is an issue. How much can you expect people to put up with in a place where every single day is going to be a struggle, not just for this crisis, but perhaps, for multiple crises and recurrent crises forever. But it was that, I suppose, it was just that feeling of, going from this is impossible, this is over, to no, it's not. There's chances here, real chances. And there have been people who've known this for a long time and who just can't get heard, can't get heeded, and can't get action on what they're saying. So yeah, those were the two kind of main impressions I think I came away with.
I think we're still trying to get Jackson on, but I know talking to him, and I think Jackson, a number of the country teams were dealing with climate change in their countries. They're working with communities to adapt to, in some of those areas, these will be pastoral people who follow their animals. Their animals were the first to be hit in those kind of serious droughts. So a lot of people now moving towards growing plants, being agro-pastoralists, where they're growing crops as well as animals, rehabilitating wells, basically preparing people, adapting to try and mitigate the damage that has been done in places like Bangladesh, putting in to stop the floods, so to reduce the impact of the floods, adapting to what they're growing, animals they use, that they're herding or farming. But it all comes down to finance. And I asked Jackson about the issue about the water, and he was saying, look, A, it's saline under Turkana, and B, it's also heavy metal. So there's a big cost. It maybe brings us round to the issue of who's going to pay for it, and this whole maybe a bit alien conversation. We might come back to it later about finance and who pays for things. Maybe if we stick to the Irish kind of context and communicating, one of the points being made, Dave, is that people can feel overwhelmed. So on the one hand, we have people who are denial, and you have to convince them that climate change is happening. The other side, you have people who are aware of it and are overwhelmed by it. What is journalism or communications role in trying to deal with people who feel overwhelmed, they feel it's just too much, there's nothing we can do?
Yeah, it is, and it happens, I'm sure all of us who work in the climate space feel a little, overwhelmed at times, because the news can be so relentlessly, bad and tough to take in. In terms of what the journalism can do, I go back to the solutions kind of, so not always foregrounding the problem, but leading off sometimes with the solutions. For journalists, actually, funnily enough, DCU is trying to set up a kind of bit like the frontline defenders, where we would give environmentalists and activists in the climate space kind of respite in DCU and in Ireland, because they need, just for their own kind of mental and physical health, to get away from it for a while. Something that struck me was something that Lindsay Hansen, who runs a kind of marine-based NGO in the UK, she was talking about how she deals with eco-anxiety, and she said, just pick a lane. You pick one thing that you can make a little bit of a difference with, something maybe that you're good at and you can add a bit of value, and you have to trust that other people are working away in their lanes, because you can't take on the whole great kind of panorama of climate impacts all over the world, but you can do a little thing in your own local area. Now, I think journalism's role could be in foregrounding people like that, and who are doing a little thing in their own little area. But I did just want to add, Eamon, if I could, about, I know myself and Carol have been talking about the difficulties and the challenges and the complexities of covering climate change. And I don't want anybody on the webinar to come away with the idea, so, Jesus, well, I'm not going to do that. I think the guide, the what did you call it? The handbook.
I call it a handbook.
The handbook.
It's an old-fashioned term.
Is there
paper
to give you ways in, and you don't have to take on the whole big monolith of climate science. There are small stories to tell as well. And the handbook gives you ways to think about going about telling them and how to frame them for your audience. So and we also need so much of this. We need journalism. It can often be a sort of like, they think maybe sometimes that they're a referee. They're not in the fight, right? They're a referee, and they're calling the what do they say in the States, the fouls and the strikes, But actually, there are a lot of journalism, they're part of the world, they're part of society, they're in this as well. So there's kind of a role for the more activist or critical advocacy type of journalist to actually say, I'm going to play a part in this. I'm not just going to observe it from the outside.
And some of the environmental media, there's environmental publications, news websites, which are particularly strong on that, who are really driving that kind of environmental journalism.
There are really good kind of digital journalism organizations. The one I really turn to a lot is Carbon Brief, but there's lots of other ones. We're talking about, though, Ireland is, I always remember when I was working in features, and we were trying to get interviews with big Hollywood stars. And we were the biggest paper in Ireland, but we were still on a par, I think, with the Yorkshire Post in the UK. So we have to realize that we're a very, in global terms, it's a minor kind of market, and we don't, I think, have the audience to maintain these kind of little startups to any great extent, unfortunately.
One of the other issues talking to environmental journalists, and each and every one of them has said the same when you talk to them about the challenge of covering climate change, and they say that it's very, very scientific, it's very data, it's very hard to get on top of, to understand yourself, let alone communicate to a very general audience. How do you tell that story of climate change and show the evidence without losing the reader or the listener?
Yeah, look, it is a challenge. And one of the big things I've noticed is our climate scientists in Ireland have really changed their language even in the last few years, and the way they present they've had to learn, because they've had to realize there's nobody else speaking for this. So we're going to have to come out of the lecture hall and do it. And we're going to have to go in front of a camera, and we never were comfortable with that. So they are doing that. Yeah, the language is just, it can tie people up in knots. I don't know how many times, you used to see, the 1.5 degrees threshold, if you like, presented as 1.5% or and it's almost comical now. But to get those simple things correct is really important, because it is like learning the financial language. Most people would have an idea of what the inflation rate might be, or what the unemployment rate might be, or what the average wage might be. These are things people become familiar with over time. Bringing the language of climate to them, and and making assumptions about what they know is still a work in progress. So I sometimes you have to remember that you are writing for or presenting to people who need everything really simple. And I suppose there's a temptation to, because some of the material that we have access to is very, it's high level. It's high level in terms of policy. It's high level in terms of the technology, and to think, well, I'll get more kudos if I write something at a high level, because those who understand it will say, oh, that's a good story. That's not who you're writing for. You have to remember you're writing for an audience with a very basic understanding. So I do find myself sometimes plowing into something, and 6 paragraphs in, I realize, no, back to the Ladybird book version, because that's who I have to write for. So even though there will be people who do this for a living, or it's part of their work or whatever, and they'll say, well, there's nothing new in that for me, or that's oversimplified. And I will rely on those people for information in the future, but that's not who I'm writing for. I have to write for people who are still getting that language and those concepts on their minds, and in their, so that we can make assumptions. We can make assumptions. We talk about now in the the Taoiseach, that everybody knows who the Taoiseach is. That for a week maybe they didn't actually. We had to keep putting in the name because it had changed. But there are certain assumptions that just happen in the news cycle that gradually, yeah, people know what that is now. We don't have to explain everything. I'm still at the stage of pretty much having to explain everything as I go. So yeah, it is complicated. And the first step in that is me understanding it as a journalist. So that took time. It took a lot of reading, and it still takes reading. And I still have a list of, when we talk about carbon budgets and we talk about sectoral emission ceilings, those are terms that I can't just throw out there without an explanation. But I still have my little written thing of what they are and what the numbers are. And there are not that many of them, but they don't sort of roll off my tongue. They don't just sit at the forefront of my mind. So, I'm constantly referring back to those. So then I have to think, well, if I'm still having to do that, what's an average reader doing? So keep it simple.
Could I just add something to that, Eamon? That chimes in. The 300 French journalists had this charter about what journalists should do about climate change, and one of them was take an educational approach, which is what you're talking about, Caroline. One of the things the examiner asked us to do was to provide these little fact boxes that they would put with every story, like what is adaptation, what is mitigation, what is the greenhouse effect, what's the circular economy. Phrases that because we're kind of, I have to keep reminding myself and colleagues in DCU, we're in the bubble, we're in the climate bubble. And as you say, ordinary people out there are outside the bubble, and you are taking a certain level of knowledge for granted that I don't think is warranted. So going back to these explaining these basic kind of terms and concepts, because it's an absolute kind of alphabet soup of acronyms and organizations, and the UNFCCC and the IPCC and all these kind of things are just can be absolutely kind of people get snowblind looking at them. There was so I do think that kind of educational approach, and also to say that for young journalists who are thinking of getting into this, I'd love you to be aware that there are people there ready to help you. There are people in universities, there are people in government departments, in the EPA, and different agencies who are approaching this with a very kind of open, good heart to help people. Like, I often get a phone call from somebody, I just want to sense check this. I just want to get a bit of background, just so the journalist has it clear in their own mind. That's there for you if you want to start writing about climate change.
Brilliant. I'm told that Jackson has now joined us. We've got Jackson online. So Jackson, good afternoon in Kenya. I'll just introduce you. Jackson McKenway is Concern Kenya's sector lead for food security and livelihoods. He works on the front line of climate change with communities who are severely impacted by climate change. He's working with extremely marginalized communities in the arid and semi-arid counties of Kenya and the urban informal settlements. Currently, he's supporting these communities to harness their capacities, enhance their resilience and coping strategies, and understand the need to productively interact with and take care of their natural resources and capital. He's working with communities who are recovering from the recent drought where 5 successive rains failed, the worst drought in the Horn of Africa in 40 years. And he's supporting them to recover, to adapt, and to prepare for the next drought. So Jackson, you're very, very welcome. And tell us a little about your experience of the impact which climate change is having on the communities you work with. And can you tell us a little about whether you think these communities can adapt to this rapidly changing situation?
Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone, and Jennifer and the team, and the audience listening in. As introduced, my name is Jackson McKenya. I work in Kenya. I've been working with the communities in the ASAL context for the last 14 years or thereabout. Now, to give a context of those who are joining us and don't have an understanding of how Kenya is a country in the east Horn of Africa, the east side of Africa. Kenya as a country is majorly arid or semi-arid, where 80% of the land mass is semi-arid, with only 20% of the population being able to live in an arable area. Our development index is majority of the population lives below $2 a day, and that means that they try to forage from the environment, as agriculture is the main driver of our economy. Over the period I have been in this sector, I'll give a scenario over the last around 8 or so years on the cyclic impact of climate change in the communities that we work in. Before 1990, we had drought every 10 to 15 years. After 1990, the frequency of the drought has changed to around 5 years. Within 5 years, you have another drought. Now, the intensity and frequency is even happening more. A scenario from 2016 and 2017, the communities we work in experienced a drought, where they lost livestock, people were malnourished, up to 1 million children were malnourished, and diseases were experienced in these communities. In 2019 and 2020, we had an invasion of desert locusts within the same context, where all the green vegetation that was available in that area was eaten up by desert locusts. Somehow they swarmed, I think, down from Yemen, down came into the Horn of Africa, Somalia, and then into Kenya. And they took away all the green vegetation at that time. Come 2021 to 2023, we experienced the worst droughts that we've ever experienced in my lifetime. I mean, I'm not older than 40 years. So experienced the worst droughts. 5 consecutive failed rainfall seasons, no rainfall, all water sources dried up, underground water either dried up, we're talking about a borehole as deep as 200 feet drying up or becoming extremely saline, the population cannot drink. And this lasted for close to 2 years. Late 2023 into 2024, we experienced one of the worst drought flooding events as a result of the El Nino phenomenon. All this period has been coupled with quite a number of pests and diseases. We have endemic and pandemic diseases, especially targeting the main lifestyle of the population in the areas we work in, which is livestock, and they practice pastoralism as their main livelihood.
And can you tell us, Jackson, I mean, how is the community working to adapt on the basis that these droughts are becoming more frequent, it's becoming more challenging to live in these areas? What kind of work are you doing to help these communities adapt for the next drought when it comes?
As concerned Kenya, we're trying to put in a number of adaptation mechanisms because the drought will be here, it will be recurring. We've been told in the next 8 months we'll have a very strong hits, which especially lead to droughts, and we'll be told that there'll be a La Nina phenomenon. So you're talking about another drought that is very soon coming. So it's here with us, so we have to know how to adapt, and we have to help the communities adapt. However, just to give a scenario before I respond to that, the investment in Kenya into adaptation is still very low. Kenya's investment in climate is majorly in mitigation, and this is investment by big multinationals, big governments, and it comes in forms of loans or in forms of business money that continues to impoverish this country, and of course reducing the money that can go into adaptation. However, as concerned, we're not sitting back and waiting for either the government or someone else to respond. We are doing our bit. So communities that in the last drought event that lasted 2 years, communities lost up to 75% of their livestock. To put this into perspective, if you lose 50% of your cows, cows is one of the livestock that is mainly kept by the communities that we work with, it will take you between 3 to 5 years to recover your full stock in a normal environment and climatic condition. The same communities have lost more than 50% of their livestock and have suffered consistent disasters from 2016, and that's the recent past, without any break. I doubt that the recovery is very easy. So they just have to continually adapt to the changing environment. And as concerned, we have said that, of course, the best time to invest in adaptation, and borrowing just from the famous Chinese saying, best time to invest from adaptation was yesterday. However, the other best time to invest is today, and we are doing that now. We have opportunities. The land, the 80% of the land that is in the ASAL is extremely virgin. It has barely been cultivated or applied any form of supportive chemicals for production. So we are promoting these communities to undertake agriculture, because if you lose your cows and for sure you'll never recover for the next 5 years and the drought will be here with you, then you have to do something else. So we're investing a lot in agriculture, supporting these communities to undertake climate smart agriculture, ensuring that they have access to drought tolerant varieties, high value crops that they can also translate into food and also take them to the market. The small livestock that is left within these communities, so ensuring that the breeds are healthy, improving the breeds through better breeding practices, ensuring that they are vaccinated and treated through on endemic diseases, ensuring that they can be able within maybe maintain a manageable stock or a manageable livestock that they can be able to help them. We also note that the water tables in these communities is there. One of the counties we work in has a very huge water table. We don't know the condition of the water, but the ones that we are obstructing or drilling at the moment, at least is water that can be used to support life. This water, we are supporting communities to improve the obstruction capacities of boreholes. 90% of the water in these communities is gotten from the underground. So improving this means solarizing a borehole, ensuring that the heat, the 45 degrees heat that is daily experienced in these communities can be harnessed through solarization of boreholes, abstracting up to 10,000 liters an hour for these communities, piping the water to livestock troughs, ensuring that these communities have water for their livestock because they value their livestock are still very much. Piping the water to a community farm, having between a 5-acre to 10-acre farms, depending on one borehole, ensuring that these communities can be able to produce food, nutritious food, and of course, food that they can translate into markets. And of course, some of the other things that, looking at the recent flood that we had recently, is these asal areas, because it's bare, the environment is very bare. So they're losing a lot of their soil and water towards the ocean, the Indian Ocean. So the other thing that we are doing as concerned is constructing what we can, and then we construct minor dams and water pans to ensure that we can harvest some of these waters and they can stay for these communities for longer. Thank you, Ewan.
Very good. Jackson, you were at COP28 in Dubai. I think Caroline here, who's joining us, was there as well. You went there to bring the voice and the experience of people being affected by climate change to the policymakers. What was you talk and you refer in your presentation there about finance and, you know, this work can be done, but we need more finance to do it. What was your expectation, or what was your view of COP, and do you have any hopes that your voice will be heard, or that climate finance in next year's COP will be addressed seriously? And likewise, let's put the same question to Caroline, who was there, but maybe first, Jackson, just what was your experience as somebody coming from Kenya to go to COP?
The experience is that first there's a willpower from the so-called, of course, the people who can invest, the economists, the big economists have the willpower to invest. They have the resources, and they had our voice. We spoke passionately about our communities, because me going there, I was not going as Concerned Worldwide, nor was I going as Jackson. I was going on behalf of the communities that we work with. So I put out the case out there that there are opportunities, even if it's not a business opportunity for you. What of the cost implication of having a population that is not productive because of the subsequent sufferings over the years, because of malnutrition that reduces your mental capacities to be able to fully engage and be productive within the economies? So me going there was to just mention that adaptation is one of the key things that we need to invest in. We barely contribute as a country to climate change, but we suffer greatest consequences because of adaptation capabilities. The investment that goes to adaptation is still very limited. So investing in us is investing in the future generation of this world.
Very good. Thank you. Caroline, what was your view as a journalist? You've covered a number of COPs. Was that your third or fourth?
Third.
Third. And what was your experience? Do you think they have an impact? And I might put the question to you, Dave, in a minute as well, as to whether COPs, these gatherings, have any impact long term.
I think they do. I think it's disproportionately small compared to, you know, the scale of the event itself, because you do have, you know, most of the world's leaders all in one place for part of it. You have all the delegations there for the 2 weeks. You have delegations working behind the scenes for months and months and months. And it's what comes out at the end seems very small. But in terms of what Jackson was talking about there, you know, from an Irish perspective, we have good access to the most powerful countries in the world as a country ourselves, and because of our access to Brussels, to the European Union. Many countries don't. And when their delegations come, this is a real opportunity for them to meet each other, but also to meet with other leaders, to meet with the main development banks, for example, who may be keeping them at arm's length in terms of investment, to meet with the private investors. You know, there were issues with COP and the nature of it, I suppose, last year. You know, but they did put, as a country, they did put, UAE did put money together as kind of a, you know, a startup support kind of system for more other commercial investors. It's things like that. They may be symbolic, and they may be because we want to look good as a country or as a host, but they're actually going to make a difference on the ground if they can be properly controlled and monitored and so on. So, you know, it has its flaws as an event, And certainly last year, I felt just even the way it was just physically organised, the groups, the NGOs, the community groups were kept at a distance from the zone where all the politicians and national delegations are. That was the layout of this very expansive, sprawling venue. In other places, there's been more mingling, more chance to mix, more accidental meetings, if you like. It was more structured. And certainly they kept journalists at bay more than in other COPs. So you don't get that level of transparency. But I would love to take some of the sort of the trade show element out of COPs, because certainly that's there as well. I'd love to make it more transparent. Every meeting, most meetings would be more available to the wider public and to journalists. But I would not. I know there's been calls to say they're pointless. You get so little out of them. That what little you get is precious. And it does put an annual focus on the issue. And as Jackson said, you do get to talk to people, you do get to network, and you do get to remember. And even from an Irish perspective, the privileged Irish perspective of remembering that whatever we're going through, whatever we will go through as a country, we are all interconnected. And, whatever about no man being an island, no country is an island, not even an island like Ireland. What happens somewhere else today, if you depending on your IT support on a company in Delhi, in India, or you've trade routes or, in that part of the world or something, good luck getting anybody who's in a fit state to work for you today. We're all interconnected. And as Jackson said, well, you may not feel a connection with Kenya, but how does it serve the world at large to have a group of people who are not productive, who cannot live in part of the world? That has knock-on effects. So that all kind of comes together, right in front of you in a fortnight in COP. So I think they're valuable for all their flaws. I think it's a valuable event.
Indeed, from a policy point of view, kind of that overview of policy, does it change? Does it make a difference?
Well, there was a lot of criticism of the last COP and over that it had taken so many years to actually include the words fossil fuels in a COP text. That made it seem like a joke almost, and the number of oil companies who attended it, and the fact it was in a petro state, and as is the next one, all kind of fed into this argument that the COP process is not fit for purpose. My take on it is, well, we're in a climate emergency with a limited number of years to achieve meaningful action, and we're going to spend some of those years trying to rebuild a UN process from scratch. That's not going to happen. So it's not really is it useful. It's the only show in town, and I think it does have its benefits. I was at the Paris COP where the Paris Agreement was signed, and I remember the small island developing states. The text said we will limit warming to 2 degrees, and they, from the floor, made this very impassioned kind of plea that at 2 degrees we're gone. We're underwater at 2 degrees. So they persuaded the plenary to include the language and aim for 1.5. Now, and that was very, very significant, So I do think, and also I found it actually quite moving to see the way alliances change, and the way, say, there's the various groupings in these COPs, and that's in a whole kind of world unto itself. Ireland negotiates as part of the EU, but you've got the umbrella group. You've got sometimes at these COPs, a coalition of high ambition emerges, and they group together and they push for something a bit more meaningful. And I do think it is significant how we in Ireland, or how the EU performs at these COPs, and who we align with, and the what comes out of them can really change things. From a journalism point of view, I think it's a really good opportunity. I was amazed at how much access journalists have, and how they can really kind of get good time with ministers and with delegations and so on, and they also get their mind kind of widened as to what's going on around the world. So I would say, you know, they're all we've got. They are flawed, but they're not like all bad.
Now I'm watching the clock. We're under pressure of time, and we're going to have a quick fire round, literally going into the questions which have come in through questions and answers. So everybody stay on their toes. I'll fire the questions around. Dave, young journalists, are they enthusiastic? Are they excited about covering climate change?
Yeah, I think they are. There's an optional module in DCU on the journalism programs, and a lot of them take it and they're quite engaged. But again, I find that they don't know an awful lot about the science, so we have to kind of go back to basics with them. But yeah, they're engaged and they want to contribute.
From Victoria for Caroline, what's the most positive climate story you have reported on?
Oh dear. Here's where everything that Dave just said gets dumped in the bin and everybody says, I don't want to report. It's, you know, the difficulty about it is, and I know that there is this new focus on solutions-based or constructive journalism, a lot of the solutions also come with difficulties in that they're very political and they're used for political purposes. So, you know, watching what maybe the offshore wind in Ireland, the first planning application went in at the end of last week for the first offshore wind farm in Ireland. And that is the first visible sign that this is real and that we as a country can start the really ramp up the transition away from fossil fuels and potentially become this big renewable energy exporter. And that's been a slow burner, very long slow burner. Suddenly it's happening. All the structures are in place. And it feels positive and it feels like a good news story. And then you see the reaction, both political and on the ground. And suddenly we're into this situation whereby it's people are talking saying, well, why are we doing offshore wind? Why aren't we doing floating wind? Why are we doing wind at all? Why aren't we doing nuclear? But I'm going to stick with positive for the moment because it is the first really tangible, manifestation of policy. Planning applications have gone in, the investors are there, the businesses are there. We might, in the next couple of years, have a big offshore wind presence in Ireland.
Question for Jackson. Jackson, are people moving? Are they being displaced as a result of climate change in Kenya? And if so, where are they moving to? That's from Sinead.
The people are being moved. People are moving away from the hinterlands, coming to urban centers. They know nothing else. So people are being, because their main lifestyle was livestock. Now they're staying in an urban center, just hopeful that someone will hear their cry. So we have a community that are settled. We have new settlements that have come up in that area that they don't know what else to do. So we have to come in and ensure that they're adapting. So we have a willing community. We have a rich environment. We have a fertile soils. The water sources are in plenty. We just need harnessing of those resources. We need to put in adaptation money and ensure that these communities are supported.
Great. Question from Georgina, maybe for Dave. How can you communicate urgency when people around climate change, when people know climate change is pressing, but they feel there are bigger, more urgent issues such as war, i.e. their attentions are elsewhere?
Yeah. There's a great piece of research that shows what is called the crowding out effect. So war and big financial shocks like the financial crisis pushed environmental coverage completely out of the media. That isn't happening anymore because we have, say, like on outlets like The Guardian, even RTE News, Caroline's outlet, there's always a climate section there. And it isn't so much just blowing with the wind anymore. It's got a kind of seat at the table that it didn't have 10 years ago. Now, how to get them engaged, there's always going to be front of mind stuff like that's very dramatic and that has much more of the kind of stuff that news likes, the drama and the I suppose it's visually very dramatic as well. But climate change coverage has kind of got to be there in the background during, previously it would have been just gone for the period of the war. Now it's kind of still there in the background. And I think that's kind of progress of the sort.
Great. Tim, we're running out of time, so I just have a couple of closing remarks I've been told I have to make. So there's a couple of other questions there. I think we'd have to have another seminar, another webinar. Just like to thank everybody for joining us today. We will be putting a recording of this webinar on our Concerns YouTube channel. As a reminder, you can download the guide from the link in the chat, or if you go to the concern.net website and look for One Planet for All, that's one, the number one planet, number four, all. Search for that and you'll find the resource there as well. Big thank you to our speakers, Jackson, Caroline, and Dave. We just touched on the surface. The insights you provided were really, really useful, very, very thought-provoking and very informative. I'd like to thank the people who helped behind the scenes, who helped make this webinar possible: Pina, Leonor, Victoria, Laura, Jenny, and John, for their assistance. Our campaigns team have told me that if you haven't had your fill of climate change, they are organizing a webinar on climate resilience for World Environment Day. That's June the 5th. That's at 12 p.m. The theme will be building climate resilience, saving lives and empowering communities. Jackson is going to be there as well, but we have other colleagues from around the world who are working climate experts on our staff who will also be contributing. You need to register in advance. And again, there's a link to that registration form on the chat. Finally, I'm told it will take 60 to 90 seconds. If you could, in the chat box, download the feedback form. We really do appreciate your feedback. We take it on board and we use it for future webinars to shape what we're doing. So once again, thanks to everybody for sharing their time and their knowledge today. And thank you very much.